The morning sun peeked through the thin curtains of Pinewood Orphanage, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. 12-year-old May opened her eyes before the wake-up bell, just as she did every day. She liked these quiet moments when the world seemed to belong only to her. From somewhere down the hall, she could hear Mrs. Wu shuffling around the kitchen. The familiar clank of pots and pans, a comforting sound that had been the backdrop to May's life for as long as she could remember. 10 years at Pinewood, a lifetime really. Her memories from before were hazy at best. A woman's gentle voice, the smell of jasmine, and a melody that seemed to follow her into her dreams. May slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the 3 other girls who shared her room. Ling was curled into a tight ball as always. Bao had kicked off her covers again, and little Jin, the newest arrival, still cried in her sleep sometimes. May tucked the blanket back around Bao's shoulders before tiptoeing out of the room. The hallway was empty, the floorboards creaking under her feet like old friends saying good morning. May knew exactly which spots to avoid to stay quiet. She made her way down to the common room, drawn there by an invisible thread, the same one that pulled her there every chance she got. In the corner of the room sat an old upright piano. Its wood was scratched and dull. Some of the white keys had yellowed with age, and a few of the black ones were chipped at the edges. To most people it looked like a piece of junk, but to May, it was treasure. She sat down on the bench and placed her fingers gently on the keys, not pressing down yet, just feeling their cool smoothness under her fingertips. This was her favorite part of the day. "You're up early again," a voice said from the doorway. May jumped a little, then relaxed when she saw it was only Mrs. Wu, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sorry," May said. "Did I wake you?" Mrs. Wu shook her head, her gray-streaked hair swaying gently. "No, child. I was already up making breakfast. Go ahead and play if you want. Just keep it soft until the others wake up." May nodded gratefully. Not all the staff at Pinewood were as understanding as Mrs. Wu. Mr. Li, who handled the orphanage's finances, often complained about the racket and threatened to have the piano removed to make space for something useful. Only Mrs. Chen, the director, had stood up for keeping it, saying that arts education was important too, even if they couldn't afford proper lessons. As Mrs. Wu returned to the kitchen, May began to play. Softly at first, her fingers finding the keys by memory rather than by training. She had no sheet music, no teacher to correct her form. What she had was an ear that could pick up a melody after hearing it just once or twice, and hands that somehow knew where to go on the keyboard. She played a folk song she'd heard on the radio, one about birds returning home after winter. The piano was out of tune, making some notes sound slightly off, but May didn't mind. She'd gotten used to its quirks, even grown fond of them. Time slipped away as she played, and before she knew it, the wake-up bell was ringing. The spell broken, May reluctantly closed the piano lid and went to help with breakfast duties. The dining hall filled with the chatter of 32 children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers. May helped serve rice porridge to the younger ones, making sure little Jin got the bowl with an extra spoonful of brown sugar, just the way she liked it. "Did you hear?" Ling whispered excitedly as they sat down with their own bowls. "Mrs. Chen said someone important is coming to visit today." "Who?" May asked, blowing on a spoonful of hot porridge. "Some rich guy," Bao chimed in, leaning across the table. At 14, she considered herself much more knowledgeable about the world than the rest of them. "I heard Mrs. Chen telling Mrs. Wu that he might be looking to adopt." May's heart gave a little jump before she could stop it. She hated that it still happened, that tiny flare of hope that sparked every time there was talk of adoption. After 10 years of watching other children get chosen, you'd think she'd have learned by now. "Don't get your hopes up," Bao said, as if reading May's thoughts. "These rich types always want babies or cute little ones, not big kids like us." May nodded, pushing down the foolish hope. Bao was right. The toddlers and little ones under 6 were usually the ones who got adopted. The rest of them, well, they were what the staff called long-term residents. After breakfast, the orphanage burst into activity. Staff members rushed around, cleaning and straightening things that hadn't been cleaned or straightened in months. The children were told to put on their best clothes, which really just meant the ones with the fewest patches and stains, and were given stern warnings about behavior. "Remember your manners," Mrs. Chen told them as they gathered in the common room. She was a tall, thin woman with kind eyes but a perpetually worried expression, running an underfunded orphanage in a forgotten corner of the city. had etched permanent lines into her forehead. Mr. Harrison is a very important businessman who has donated to several children's charities. We want to make a good impression. The younger children nodded solemnly. The older ones exchanged glances, knowing the drill. Important visitors meant being trotted out like show ponies, smiling and performing whatever talents they had, in hopes of either being adopted or, more likely, inspiring enough pity to loosen some purse strings for donations. May, Mrs. Chen said, pulling her aside after the others had been dismissed to prepare. Would you be willing to play the piano if asked? Mr. Harrison is reportedly a music lover. May felt her stomach tighten. Playing alone in the early morning was one thing. Playing for a stranger, an important rich stranger, was something else entirely. I don't know any proper songs, she stammered. I've never had lessons, Mrs. Chen patted her shoulder. Just play whatever you feel comfortable with. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing that we provide a well-rounded environment here. Despite our limited resources, May wanted to point out that an out-of-tune piano that no one knew how to play properly hardly constituted a well-rounded environment, but she kept quiet and nodded. The hours before, Mr. Harrison's arrival crawled by with agonizing slowness. The younger children were too excited to focus on their lessons, and even the teenagers felt the tension in the air. May tried to practice a bit on the piano, but knowing she might have to perform later made her fingers stiff and clumsy. At exactly 2 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up outside the orphanage. The children who had been peeking out the windows ran to their assigned places, straightening their clothes and putting on their best smiles. Mr. Harrison did not smile back as he entered. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair cut in an expensive style. His suit probably cost more than all the furniture in the orphanage combined, but it was his eyes that May noticed most, gray and cold, like the sky before a storm. Mrs. Chen greeted him with nervous enthusiasm, thanking him for taking the time to visit their humble facility. Mr. Harrison merely nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the children lined up in age order, the peeling paint on the walls, the mismatched furniture. As I mentioned on the phone, Mrs. Chen was saying, her words coming out faster than usual. We're always grateful for the interest of community leaders like yourself. Whether you're considering adoption or donation, we're happy to show you around and introduce you to our wonderful children. I'm here to observe, Mr. Harrison said. His voice was deep and clipped, each word precise. My late wife was interested in children's welfare. I'm considering establishing a foundation in her name. Mrs. Chen's smile brightened. How wonderful. Well, we've prepared a small program to showcase our children's talents and achievements, despite our limited resources. What followed was the usual parade that accompanied important visitors. The youngest children sang a song, slightly off-key but adorably enthusiastic. The school-aged ones recited poems they'd learned. A few of the older boys demonstrated the basic carpentry skills they were learning from Mr. Zhang, the maintenance man who came twice a week. Through it all, Mr. Harrison's expression remained unchanged, his eyes evaluating everything with a coldness that made May shiver. He barely responded to Mrs. Chen's cheerful commentary, offering only occasional nods or single-word replies. When they reached the common room again, his gaze fell on the old piano in the corner. Something flickered in his eyes, the first real emotion May had seen there. You have a piano, he said, interrupting Mrs. Chen's explanation about their educational program. Oh, yes, she said, looking flustered by the sudden change in topic. It was donated years ago. We try to provide some exposure to the arts, though we can't afford regular music lessons. Mr. Harrison walked over to the instrument, running a finger along its scratched surface. It's badly in need of tuning. Yes, well, our budget, Mrs. Chen began. I was a concert pianist in my youth, Mr. Harrison said, cutting her off again. He pressed one key, wincing slightly at the off-key note it produced. The room fell silent. Even the youngest children seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Mr. Harrison turned, his cold eyes scanning the group until they landed on May, who had unconsciously drifted closer to the piano. You, he said, pointing at her. Do you play? All eyes turned to May. She felt her cheeks grow hot under the attention. Mrs. Chen started to explain, but Mr. Harrison raised a hand to silence her. I asked the girl, not you, he said, his tone making it clear he didn't appreciate interruptions. May swallowed hard. A little, she managed to say. I taught myself. A corner of Mr. Harrison's mouth lifted in what might have been amusement or disdain. It was hard to tell. Self-taught, he repeated as if the words tasted strange. Then, with a dismissive wave and a sneer that made May's stomach clench, he issued a challenge. Play the piano and I'll adopt you. The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable. He was mocking her, mocking all of them with their second-hand clothes and hopeful faces. He didn't expect her to play well. He expected her to fail, to provide him with a moment's entertainment at her expense. Mrs. Chen's face paled. Mr. Harrison, I don't think... It's a simple proposition, he said, his eyes never leaving May's face. If she's as good as she claims, she gets a home. If not... He shrugged, leaving the consequence unspoken. The other children watched in stunned silence. Even Bao, usually quick with a comeback, seemed at a loss for words. May stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew she was being toyed with, knew that this rich man with his expensive suit and cold eyes had no intention of adopting a 12-year-old girl who could barely play a proper scale. But something in her refused to back down from the challenge, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. With shaking legs, she walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. The old wood creaked beneath her, a familiar sound that gave her a small measure of comfort. She placed her fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. And then, she began to play. The room fell silent as May's fingers hovered over the keys. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock and Mr. Harrison's impatient sigh. May closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shut out the stares of everyone around her. She had never played for an audience before. Not a real one anyway, just Mrs. Wu early in the mornings, or sometimes the younger children who would dance around the room to whatever tune she managed to coax from the old piano. But this was different. This was Mr. Harrison, with his expensive suit and cruel smirk, watching her with those cold gray eyes that seemed to be looking for flaws. This was all the other children holding their breath, some hoping she would succeed, others secretly wishing she would fail. This was Mrs. Chen, her face tight with worry, probably already calculating how to smooth things over when May inevitably embarrassed them all. May took a deep breath and began to play. She started with the only song she knew from beginning to end, a folk melody her mother used to hum, or at least someone she believed was her mother. The memory was so faint that sometimes May wondered if she had made it up, created a mother out of wishes and dreams. But the melody felt real, a simple tune about blossoms floating on a river. The notes came out hesitant at first, her fingers stiff with nerves. A wrong note made her wince. She could feel Mr. Harrison's disapproval without even looking at him. She wanted to stop, to run from the room, but where would she go? This was her home, such as it was. Instead of stopping, May closed her eyes again and tried to forget about Mr. Harrison. She thought about early mornings with Mrs. Wu, about the kitchen smells of rice porridge and tea, about the rare moments when she felt almost happy. The music began to flow more naturally, her fingers finding the right keys almost on their own. When she finished the folk song, she paused, expecting Mr. Harrison to cut her off with some dismissive comment. But he remained silent. Taking his silence as permission, she moved into another melody, this one from a radio program she'd heard. It was more complicated, and she stumbled in places where she couldn't quite remember how it went, making up her own notes to fill the gaps. And then, something strange happened. As she played, the world around her began to fade away. She no longer felt the weight of all those eyes on her. She no longer worried about wrong notes or Mr. Harrison's judgment. She was just May. And this was just music, the one thing in her life that had always been there, always been hers. Without planning to, she transitioned into a melody she didn't know she knew. It rose from somewhere deep inside her like a forgotten dream. Her fingers moved across the keys with surprising confidence, finding chords she had never played before. The melody was haunting, filled with a longing that May couldn't name but somehow understood completely. When the final notes faded into silence, May opened her eyes, almost surprised to find herself still in the common room at Pinewood. For a moment she had been somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't quite remember but desperately missed. She turned slowly on the bench to face Mr. Harrison, bracing herself for his mockery. But the expression on his face made her breath catch in her throat. The coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by something she couldn't read. His face had lost its color and his hands, gripping the handle of his walking cane, were white-knuckled. He looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. "Where did you learn that last piece?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. May blinked, confused by the question and his reaction. I didn't learn it anywhere. It just came out. Impossible, he said, taking a step toward her. That piece is not published. It's not recorded. No one knows it except... He stopped abruptly as if he'd said too much. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, placing a protective hand on May's shoulder. "Mr. Harrison, I think that's enough for now. May has clearly demonstrated her natural talent, but she's not a performing monkey. If you're not serious about adoption, we should move on with the tour." The sharpness in Mrs. Chen's voice surprised May. The director was usually so careful around potential donors, so eager to please, but something in Mr. Harrison's intensity must have triggered her protective instincts. Mr. Harrison seemed not to hear her. He was staring at May with an unsettling focus. "How old are you?" he asked. 12, May answered, her voice small. "And how long have you been here?" 10 years. So you were brought here when you were 2. It wasn't a question, but May nodded anyway. "Who brought you? What was their name?" Mrs. Chen intervened again. "Mr. Harrison, I understand you're interested in May's background, but these questions are quite personal. Perhaps we should discuss this in my office, where we can check the records properly." Mr. Harrison finally tore his gaze from May and looked at Mrs. Chen. Something in his expression made the director take a small step back. "Yes," he said, his voice regaining its earlier coldness. "Your office now." Mrs. Chen hesitated, then nodded. "Children, please continue with your afternoon activities. Mrs. Wu will supervise." She gestured for Mr. Harrison to follow her down the hallway toward the administrative section of the orphanage. As they left, the room erupted into whispered conversations. Bao was by May's side in an instant. "What was that?" she demanded, her eyes wide. "I've never seen you play like that before. And did you see his face? He looked like he'd been slapped." May shook her head, still trying to process what had happened. "I don't know what came over me. That last song, I don't even know where it came from." "Well, whatever it was, you freaked him out," Bao said with a hint of admiration. "That's got to count for something." Little Jin tugged at May's sleeve. "Does this mean he's going to adopt you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The idea of May leaving seemed to upset her. "No," May said firmly, giving Jin's hand a reassuring squeeze. He was just being cruel. He never had any intention of adopting anyone. But even as she said it, May wasn't entirely convinced. There had been something in Mr. Harrison's reaction. Something genuine beneath the coldness. Not kindness exactly, but something real. Mrs. Wu clapped her hands, calling the children to order. "Come now, back to your afternoon lessons. May, you too. Whatever's happening with Mr. Harrison is for Mrs. Chen to handle." May nodded and followed the others, but her mind remained in the common room, puzzling over the music that had flowed through her fingers and the strange reaction it had provoked. In Mrs. Chen's office, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Harrison stood by the window, looking out at the small playground where the youngest children were now playing, under the supervision of one of the junior staff members. "I need to see her records," he said without turning around. "All of them." Mrs. Chen sat behind her desk, her back straight, her hands folded in front of her. "Mr. Harrison, I understand your interest, but I must remind you that our children's records are confidential. If you're genuinely considering adoption, there's a process to follow, forms to fill out, background checks." "I don't have time for bureaucracy," he cut her off, turning to face her. "That girl played a piece of music that no one should know. A piece my wife wrote for our daughter before she died." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Harrison, but I still don't see my daughter disappeared 10 years ago," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "After my wife's funeral, I wasn't well. Grief does strange things to a person. My wife's family took her, said they would look after her while I recovered. When I was finally in my right mind again, they told me she had died too. A fever, they said. Too quick for doctors to help." He paused, his gaze distant, seeing something beyond the walls of the small office. "I believed them. God help me, I believed them. I was so deep in grief already, what was one more layer? I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand proof. I just accepted that I had lost everything." Mrs. Chen was silent, watching him with a mixture of sympathy and caution. "But that music," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice stronger now, "that lullaby. My wife wrote it for our daughter. She used to play it for her every night. No one else has ever heard it. No one else has ever played it. Except that girl out there." "Mr. Harrison," Mrs. Chen said gently, "I understand this is difficult, but you must see how unlikely it is. May has been here since she was 2 years old. She was brought in by a distant relative who couldn't care for her after her mother died. At least that's what our records show." "Show me," he demanded. "Show me those records." Mrs. Chen hesitated, then nodded. She turned to the filing cabinet behind her desk and began searching through the folders. Meanwhile, May was finding it impossible to focus on her afternoon lessons. The math problems on her worksheet blurred before her eyes as her mind kept returning to the strange music that had come through her, and to Mr. Harrison's even stranger reaction. "May," her teacher called, noticing her distraction. "Please solve the problem on the board." May looked up, startled. The blackboard showed a fraction problem that she would normally find easy, but today the numbers might as well have been in a foreign language. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, feeling her cheeks grow hot as the other children stared. "I wasn't paying attention." The teacher sighed. "See me after class. Now, Bao, perhaps you can show us how it's done." As Bao went to the board, May tried to focus, but a commotion in the hallway drew everyone's attention. Mrs. Chen's voice, unusually loud, could be heard through the classroom door. "Mr. Harrison, please. This is highly irregular." The classroom door swung open and Mr. Harrison stood there, his face flushed with emotion, a folder clutched in his hand. His eyes scanned the room until they found May. "You," he said, pointing at her with a shaking finger. "Come with me." The teacher stepped forward. "Sir, we're in the middle of a lesson. If you need to speak with one of our students, you should arrange it through Mrs. Chen." "This can't wait," Mr. Harrison said, his voice brooking no argument. "May now." May looked at her teacher helplessly, then at Mrs. Chen, who had appeared behind Mr. Harrison, looking flustered and concerned. "It's all right," Mrs. Chen said after a moment. "May, please go with Mr. Harrison to my office. I'll be there too." Heart pounding, May gathered her books and pencils, acutely aware of the curious stares of her classmates. As she walked to the door, Bao caught her eye and mouthed, "What's happening?" May could only shake her head. She had no idea, but the intensity in Mr. Harrison's eyes told her that whatever it was about to change everything. The walk to Mrs. Chen's office felt like the longest journey of May's life. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each step heavier than the last. Mr. Harrison walked ahead, his back rigid, the folder still clutched tightly in his hand. Mrs. Chen followed behind May, her presence a small comfort in the storm of confusion that swirled through the girl's mind. What had she done wrong? The question repeated itself over and over. Was Mr. Harrison angry about her playing? Had she somehow offended him? She couldn't make sense of his reaction, the shock in his eyes, the intensity of his questions. When they reached the office, Mr. Harrison held the door open, his gaze fixed on May with an unsettling focus. She slipped past him, careful not to brush against his expensive suit, and stood awkwardly in the middle of the small room, unsure where to put herself. "Sit down," Mr. Harrison said, gesturing to the chair across from Mrs. Chen's desk. His voice was softer now, less commanding, but still carrying an undercurrent of urgency that made May's heart race. Mrs. Chen took her usual seat behind the desk, her expression a careful mask of professional calm, though May could see the worry in her eyes. "May," Mrs. Chen began gently, "Mr. Harrison has some questions about your background. I know we've talked about this before, and there isn't much in your records, but it's important that you try to remember anything you can about your life before Pinewood." May nodded, though she had little hope of providing any useful information. They had been through this exercise before, on her birthdays, when she would ask Mrs. Chen if there was anything new in her file, any clue about who she was or where she came from. "What do you remember about your mother?" Mr. Harrison asked abruptly, sitting down in the chair next to May's rather than across the desk, turning to face her directly. May fidgeted with the hem of her worn sweater. "Not much," she admitted. "Sometimes I think I remember her voice or the smell of her perfume. Jasmine, I think. But I was so little when she died. She wasn't even sure if these were real memories or just things she had made up over the years. Comforting stories she told herself when the orphanage felt too lonely. And the music? Mr. Harrison pressed. The song you played at the end. Where did you hear it? Mee shook her head, confused. I don't know. It just came out. I don't remember learning it. Mr. Harrison exchanged a glance with Mrs. Chen, who looked equally puzzled. May, he said, his voice strangely gentle now. That song was a lullaby. A very special one that my wife wrote for our daughter. No one else knows it. It was never published, never recorded. The only people who have ever heard it are my wife, myself, and our daughter. May stared at him, not understanding what he was saying, or perhaps afraid to understand. But that's impossible. How could I play a song I've never heard? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Mr. Harrison said. He opened the folder he had been carrying and pulled out a photograph, placing it carefully on the desk in front of May. The photo showed a woman with long dark hair and kind eyes, sitting at a grand piano. On her lap was a little girl no more than 2 years old, reaching out with tiny fingers to touch the keys. Both were smiling, caught in a moment of shared joy. This is my wife, Li Wei, Mr. Harrison said softly, and our daughter, Li Mei. May felt the room tilt slightly. She stared at the photograph, at the woman's face, trying to connect it to the hazy fragments of memory that sometimes visited her dreams. And the little girl, the name. It couldn't be a coincidence. I don't understand, she whispered. Mr. Harrison reached into the folder again and pulled out another document. According to your orphanage records, you were brought here 10 years ago by a woman who claimed to be your mother's cousin. She said your mother had died suddenly and she couldn't care for you. She gave your name as May, just May, no family name, and said you were 2 years old. He placed the document beside the photograph. She signed the surrender papers as Linjia. Does that name mean anything to you? Mee shook her head, her throat tight with emotion. She had never known the name of the person who had left her at Pinewood. Linjia was my wife's younger sister, Mr. Harrison said, his voice catching slightly. After my wife died, I wasn't well. I couldn't function, couldn't take care of myself, let alone a 2-year-old child. Linjia offered to care for May while I recovered. When I was finally myself again, months later, she told me that May had fallen ill with a fever and died too. Mrs. Chen gasped softly. And you believed her? A shadow of pain crossed Mr. Harrison's face. I was already broken by my wife's death. The thought of losing my daughter too. It was almost a relief to sink deeper into grief, to give up completely. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand proof. I just accepted it and tried to forget. He turned back to May, his eyes searching her face. But you didn't die. She brought you here instead. Gave you a new life far away from me. May felt dizzy with the weight of his words, the implications too enormous to grasp fully. Are you saying you think I'm your daughter? I don't think, Mr. Harrison said firmly. I know, the lullaby proves it. No one else could know that melody. And now that I look at you, his voice broke. You have her eyes, my wife's eyes. Mrs. Chen looked between them, clearly struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. Mr. Harrison, while this is certainly remarkable, we need to be cautious. We can't simply release May into your custody based on a story and a song, no matter how convincing it seems. There are procedures, legal requirements. I understand, Mr. Harrison said, not taking his eyes off May. I'll do whatever is necessary. DNA tests, court orders, whatever you need. But I won't lose her again, not now that I've found her. May sat frozen in her chair, unable to fully comprehend the enormity of what was happening. All her life she had dreamed of being claimed, of someone coming to Pinewood and recognizing her, saying, "That one. She's mine." But in her dreams it had been a joyful moment, filled with tears and hugs and immediate belonging. This was different. Mr. Harrison, the man who might be her father, was still largely a stranger, and not a particularly warm or kind one at that. The coldness she had sensed in him earlier hadn't entirely disappeared, just been temporarily overshadowed by shock and urgency. What happens now? She asked, her voice small. Now, Mrs. Chen said, taking control of the situation. We proceed carefully. Mr. Harrison, I'll need to contact our legal department and the proper authorities. If what you're saying is true, and I must stress that we need verification, there will be a process to follow. Mr. Harrison nodded impatiently. Of course. Whatever it takes. In the meantime, Mrs. Chen continued, I think it would be appropriate for you and May to spend some time getting to know each other. Supervised visits here at Pinewood, until we have more clarity about the situation. I'd like that, Mr. Harrison said, looking at May with an expression she couldn't quite read. Hope, perhaps mixed with fear and decades of grief. May nodded hesitantly. Part of her was terrified at the prospect of spending time alone with this intense, complicated man. Another part, a part she barely dared acknowledge, was desperately curious. Could he really be her father? Could she really have a family, a history, a place in the world beyond Pinewood's walls? May I return tomorrow? Mr. Harrison asked Mrs. Chen, though his eyes remained on May. That would be fine, Mrs. Chen agreed. May has classes in the morning, but perhaps in the afternoon? Mr. Harrison nodded. I'll bring photographs, documents, things that might help her remember. Remember what? May wondered. A life she had barely lived? A mother she had lost before she could truly know her? It seemed impossible, yet the melody she had played, the lullaby, had come from somewhere deep inside her, a place she hadn't known existed until her fingers found the keys. Can I tell my friends about this? May asked suddenly, thinking of Bao and the others who would be bursting with questions when she returned to class. Mrs. Chen hesitated. Perhaps it would be best to keep this between us for now until we have more certainty. I'll speak with your teacher and explain that you're helping Mr. Harrison with something important. May nodded, relieved at not having to explain something she barely understood herself. As if sensing her overwhelm, Mrs. Chen stood up. I think that's enough for today. May, why don't you go back to your room and rest for a bit? I'll have Mrs. Wu bring you some tea. Grateful for the reprieve, May stood up. Mr. Harrison rose as well, towering over her. Until tomorrow then, he said, his voice gentler than she had heard it before. May nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and fled the office. The dormitory was empty when she reached it. Everyone else still in their afternoon classes. May sank onto her bed, her mind spinning with everything she had learned. If Mr. Harrison was telling the truth, then she wasn't just May from Pinewood. She was Li Mei, daughter of Li Wei, and she realized she didn't even know Mr. Harrison's first name. She lay back on her thin pillow, staring at the ceiling. The lullaby played in her head, clearer now that she had brought it into the world through her fingers. It was a sweet, simple melody, the kind that could comfort a child to sleep. Had her mother really written it just for her? Had those elegant hands in the photograph played it while May, tiny Li Mei, drifted into dreams? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Wu entered carrying a steaming cup of tea. Mrs. Chen told me what happened, she said, placing the cup on the small table beside May's bed. How are you feeling? May sat up, accepting the tea gratefully. I don't know. It doesn't feel real. Mrs. Wu sat on the edge of the bed, her weight making the old springs creak. Life can change in an instant, child. One moment, you're playing the piano for a stranger. The next, that stranger might be your father. She patted May's knee. But remember, no matter what happens, you still get to decide who you are. May sipped her tea, letting the warmth spread through her. What if he's wrong? What if I'm not his daughter? Then you are still May, Mrs. Wu said simply. Still our May, who plays beautiful music and helps the little ones with their breakfast and always has a kind word for old Mrs. Wu. Tears pricked at May's eyes. And what if he's right? What if I have to leave Pinewood? Mrs. Wu's eyes softened. Then you will have found your family, which is what we wish for all our children, even when it breaks our hearts to see them go. She squeezed May's hand. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. One day at a time, May nodded, grateful for Mrs. Wu's steady presence, her practical wisdom. One day at a time. Tomorrow Mr. Harrison would return with his photographs and documents. Tomorrow she might learn more about who she was, where she came from. Tomorrow everything might change again. But today, she was still May of Pinewood, sitting on her familiar bed drinking Mrs. Wu's tea, listening to the distant sounds of her friends in their classrooms, the creaking of the old building that had been her home for as long as she could remember. One day at a time. May barely slept that night. Her mind kept returning to the photograph of the woman at the piano, Li Wei, her possible mother, and the little girl on her lap who might have been May herself. Whenever she closed her eyes, the lullaby played in her head, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling in its familiarity. By morning, her emotions had settled into a cautious hope, tempered by years of disappointment. She had learned long ago not to expect too much, not to believe too quickly in the possibility of leaving Pinewood behind. But despite her best efforts to stay grounded, a tiny flame of excitement flickered inside her. Bao noticed it immediately at breakfast. "Something happened yesterday," she said, studying May's face with narrowed eyes. "You look different." "I'm just tired," May said, stirring her rice porridge without eating it. "I didn't sleep well." "It's more than that," Bao insisted. "It's that rich guy, isn't it?" "Mr. Harrison, did he say something to you?" Before May could answer, Mrs. Chen appeared at their table. "May, after your morning classes, please come to my office. Mr. Harrison will be arriving at 1 o'clock. A hush fell over the nearby tables as the other children listened in. Mrs. Chen, realizing she had an audience, added in a louder voice, "Mr. Harrison has expressed interest in funding music lessons for some of our students. May, as our most accomplished pianist, will help us determine what resources we need." It was a plausible explanation, but Bao wasn't fooled. As soon as Mrs. Chen walked away, she leaned across the table. "Music lessons?" "Yeah, right. Something weird is going on." "I can't talk about it yet," May said quietly. "Mrs. Chen asked me not to." Bao's eyes widened. "So there is something." "I knew it." "Please, Bao," May pleaded. "I promise I'll tell you when I can." Bao sat back, clearly bursting with curiosity but willing to respect May's request. For now, at least. "Fine, but it better be a good story when you finally spill it." The morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. May stared at her textbooks without seeing the words, her thoughts constantly drifting to the upcoming meeting with Mr. Harrison. What photographs would he bring? What would she learn about her past, about herself? The questions swirled through her mind, making it impossible to focus on fractions or grammar rules. When the lunch bell finally rang, May hurried through her meal and made her way to Mrs. Chen's office. The director was already there, arranging chairs in a small semicircle rather than her usual setup with the desk between her and visitors. "Ah, May," she said, looking up with a smile that didn't quite hide her nervousness. "Come in, Mr. Harrison should be here soon." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Wu appeared, announcing, "Mr. Harrison has arrived." He entered carrying a leather briefcase that looked as expensive as his suit. Today, May noticed, his salt and pepper hair was less severely styled, and he had traded his formal business wear for something slightly more casual, though still clearly costly. "May," he said, nodding at her with an awkward formality that suggested he wasn't quite sure how to greet her, not as a stranger but not yet as a daughter either. "Mr. Harrison," she replied, equally formal. Mrs. Chen gestured to the chairs. "Please, let's all sit down. Would anyone like tea?" They declined, too focused on the matter at hand for social niceties. Mr. Harrison sat across from May, placing his briefcase carefully on his lap. "I brought some things I thought might help," he said, opening the case and pulling out a small photo album. "These are pictures of Li Wei and little May, from before." He handed the album to May, who took it with trembling hands. She opened it slowly, almost afraid of what she might see, or worse, what she might not see, what might not trigger any recognition at all. The first page showed the same woman from yesterday's photograph. Li Wei standing in a garden, her face tilted toward the sun, a serene smile on her lips. She wore a simple blue dress and her long dark hair fell loose around her shoulders. "She was a pianist," Mr. Harrison said softly, watching May's face. "Classically trained. We met when I attended one of her recitals in Hong Kong. I was there on business and a colleague invited me to the concert. I had never heard anyone play like she did, with such feeling, such understanding of the music." May turned the page. There was a wedding photo, Li Wei in a white gown, standing beside a younger Mr. Harrison. He was smiling in the picture, his face softer, his eyes warmer than May had ever seen them. "We were married 6 months later," he continued. "My family thought it was too fast, but when you know, you know." A shadow crossed his face. "We had 5 wonderful years together before she got sick. 5 years and 1 beautiful daughter." May turned to the next page and felt her breath catch. There she was. Or at least a little girl who could have been her, sitting at a toy piano, her face scrunched in concentration, tiny fingers pressed against the colorful keys. "That was your second birthday present." Mr. Harrison said. You loved it so much you would cry when we tried to get you to stop playing for meals or bedtime. Just like your mother. May stared at the photo, searching for some flicker of memory, some connection to the child in the image. But there was nothing, just the strange sense that she was looking at someone else's life, someone else's past. I don't remember, she whispered, hating the disappointment in her own voice. You were very young, Mr. Harrison said gently. It would be surprising if you did remember clearly. But the lullaby, that came from somewhere, didn't it? May nodded slowly. The lullaby was real, a connection she couldn't explain but couldn't deny either. She continued through the album. There were more photos of the little girl, at the beach building a sandcastle in a high chair with food smeared across her face, asleep in Li Wei's arms. And then abruptly the photos of the child stopped. The last few pages showed only Li Wei, growing visibly thinner, her smile more forced but her eyes still bright with life. The last year of her illness, Mr. Harrison explained, his voice tight. I couldn't bear to take pictures of May during that time. Everything was focused on treatments, on hope that kept slipping away. Looking back, I regret that. Those would have been precious memories to keep. Mrs. Chen, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. Mr. Harrison, I've been in contact with our legal department this morning. Given the circumstances, they believe a DNA test would be the most straightforward way to confirm your relationship to May. He nodded. Of course. I've already arranged for a private lab to collect samples today if that's acceptable. They can have results within 48 hours. That's very efficient, Mrs. Chen said, sounding impressed despite herself. When it comes to my daughter, I don't believe in wasting time, he replied. I've lost 10 years already. May closed the album, feeling the weight of those lost years. Years she had spent wondering who she was, where she came from, whether anyone in the world was missing her. And all that time this man had believed she was dead, had grieved for her, had built a wall around his heart that had turned him cold and distant. If, she started, then corrected herself. When the test shows I'm your daughter, what happens next? Mr. Harrison looked startled by the question, as if he hadn't thought that far ahead. Well, you would come home with me, of course. To your home. My home is here, May said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She immediately regretted them when she saw the flash of hurt in Mr. Harrison's eyes. I mean, this is the only home I remember. I don't know anything else. Mrs. Chen reached over and patted May's hand reassuringly. It's a big adjustment to consider, May. No one expects you to feel immediately comfortable with such a change. If Mr. Harrison is indeed your father, there would naturally be a transition period. Perhaps weekend visits at first, then longer stays, until you both feel ready for a permanent arrangement. Mr. Harrison frowned slightly, clearly not thrilled with the idea of such a gradual process, but he nodded. Yes, of course. Whatever makes May comfortable. It was the first time he had used just her name without the Li before it. May wondered if it was a conscious choice or simply a slip. I have another question, she said, gathering her courage. What is your first name? I don't even know what to call you. A hint of color touched Mr. Harrison's cheeks. I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself properly. It's David, David Harrison. David, May repeated, testing the name. It felt strange on her tongue, foreign in a way that went beyond language. You used to call me Baba, he said softly, but I don't expect, that is, you should call me whatever feels right to you. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. I couldn't imagine calling this near stranger Baba or Dad or anything so intimate. Not yet, maybe not for a long time. But Mr. Harrison suddenly seemed too formal for someone who might be her father. Mrs. Wu's timely knock on the door broke the tension. The people from the laboratory are here, she announced. Mr. Harrison David straightened up, all business again. Excellent. Let's get this done, and then perhaps May might like to show me around Pinewood, if that's allowed. Mrs. Chen nodded. I think that would be appropriate. May knows this place better than anyone. The DNA test itself was simple. A swab inside the cheek, sealed in a labeled container, paperwork signed. The lab technicians were efficient and professional, treating the whole process as routine, though for May nothing about it felt ordinary. When they had gone, David turned to her with an awkward smile. So how about that tour? May nodded, still feeling dazed by everything that was happening. We could start with the garden, she suggested. It's the nicest part of Pinewood. As they walked through the hallways, May was acutely aware of the curious stares from staff and children alike. News traveled fast in the orphanage. Everyone knew something unusual was happening with the rich visitor and quiet May who played the piano. In the garden, with its neat rows of vegetables and small flower beds tended by the children, May felt herself relax slightly. This was her domain. She knew every plant, had helped grow many of them from seeds. "I spend a lot of time out here," she told David. "It's peaceful." He nodded, looking around with interest that seemed genuine. "Your mother loved gardening, too. We had a small balcony garden in our apartment in the city, and she grew the most amazing herbs and flowers in that tiny space. She always said that helping things grow was good for the soul." May felt a small thrill at this new piece of information about the woman who might have been her mother. What else did she like to do? Besides piano and gardening? David's face softened with memory. She loved old movies. Black and white films from Hollywood's golden age. She collected vintage postcards. She couldn't cook to save her life. We ate a lot of takeout, but she made the best jasmine tea I've ever tasted. Jasmine, May whispered. "I remember that smell." David looked at her sharply. "You do?" May nodded slowly. "Sometimes when I'm half asleep, I think I can smell jasmine perfume or maybe tea. I always thought I was making it up." "You weren't," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always smelled of jasmine. It was her signature scent." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Then May led him to a small bench beneath an old apple tree. "This is my favorite spot," she said, sitting down. "In the spring, when the blossoms are out, it's like sitting under a pink cloud." David sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. "May," he said after a moment, "I want you to know that I understand this is all very sudden and strange for you. I don't expect you to immediately think of me as your father, or to feel comfortable with the idea of leaving the only home you remember." May looked at him in surprise, touched by his attempt to understand her perspective. "But I also want you to know," he continued, "that not a day has gone by in the last 10 years when I haven't thought about my little girl. Even believing you were gone, you were always with me. Finding you alive, it's a miracle I never dared hope for." His voice cracked on the last words, and May saw that his eyes were damp. This display of raw emotion from the previously cold, controlled man moved her deeply. "I hope the test is positive," she said quietly. "I hope you are my father." It was the first time she had admitted it aloud, even to herself. The hope that had been building inside her, the desire to belong to someone, to have a history, a family, it was overwhelming in its intensity. David looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you for saying that," he said softly. "It means more than you know." As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden, May realized that whether or not the DNA test confirmed their relationship, something had already changed. For the first time in her life, she was starting to see a future beyond Pinewood's walls, a future that both excited and terrified her. The next 2 days passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. May went through her normal routine, classes, chores, meals, but her mind was elsewhere, counting down the hours until the DNA test results would arrive. David had returned to his home but called twice to check in, his previously cold demeanor continuing to thaw with each conversation. Bao had finally gotten the story out of May, listening with wide-eyed amazement as May explained about the lullaby, the photographs, and the possibility that she might be David Harrison's long-lost daughter. "So you might be rich," Bao said when May finished, focusing on what seemed to her the most important detail. May shook her head. "That's not what matters." "Maybe not to you," Bao replied with a grin, "but it sure wouldn't hurt." Despite Bao's teasing, May knew her friend was worried about what would happen if the test was positive, worried about losing May from her daily life at Pinewood. May was worried too, though in a different way. What would it be like to live with David? Would she fit into his world? Would he expect her to suddenly be the daughter he lost, or would he give her time to find her own way? On the afternoon the results were due, Mrs. Chen called May to her office. David was already there, sitting stiffly in his chair, his face unreadable. Mrs. Wu was there too, standing by the window, her presence a comforting constant. "The laboratory called," Mrs. Chen said once May was seated. "They've emailed the results." May's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. She looked at David, who gave her a small, tight smile that didn't hide his own nervousness. Mrs. Chen turned her computer screen so they could all see it. then opened the email. There were a lot of technical terms and numbers that meant nothing to May, but at the bottom, highlighted in bold, was the conclusion. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. This alleged father cannot be excluded as the biological father of the tested child. For a moment, no one spoke. May stared at the screen, trying to absorb what those clinical words actually meant. She had a father. David Harrison was her father. She wasn't just May from Pinewood. She was Lee May Harrison. Well, Mrs. Chen said, finally breaking the silence, I think that's quite definitive. David let out a long breath, as if he'd been holding it since the moment he first heard May play the lullaby. Yes, he said softly. Yes, it is. He turned to May, and she was startled to see tears in his eyes. You're my daughter, he said, his voice filled with wonder. You're really my daughter. Something broke open inside May at those words. A dam she hadn't known was there. Tears spilled down her cheeks as years of wondering, of not belonging, of being no one from nowhere, suddenly crystallized into this one perfect fact. She was someone's daughter. She had a place in the world. Without thinking, she stood up and moved toward David. He rose to meet her, arms opening hesitantly, giving her the chance to pull back if she wanted to, but May didn't pull back. She stepped into her father's embrace for the first time in 10 years. It wasn't like the movies. There was no sudden rush of memories, no magical sense of coming home. David felt like a stranger still, his expensive cologne unfamiliar, his body stiff with his own uncertainty. But underneath that was something else, something May couldn't name but somehow recognized, a fundamental rightness, as if some missing piece had finally clicked into place. When they separated, both wiping away tears, Mrs. Wu was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even Mrs. Chen looked moved, though she quickly composed herself into professional mode. We'll need to discuss next steps, she said. As May is legally under our care, there will be paperwork to complete. Custody to transfer. Mr. Harrison, please. Call me David, he interrupted. David, Mrs. Chen corrected herself with a small smile. You'll need to file for custody through the proper channels. Given the DNA evidence and the circumstances, I don't anticipate any issues, but these things take time. How much time? David asked, a hint of his old impatience showing through. A few weeks at least, Mrs. Chen replied. In the meantime, as we discussed, we can arrange for May to visit your home, to begin getting comfortable with the idea of living there. May felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought. Would I start at a new school right away? David glanced at her, sensing her unease. Not until you're ready, he said. There's no rush. The school year is well underway, and I'd rather you had time to adjust to everything else first. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. I think that's wise. May has been through a significant shock, even if it's a happy one. Gradual transitions are usually best in these situations. They spent the next hour discussing practical details. When May would visit David's home for the first time, what belongings she might want to bring, how often she could return to Pinewood during the transition period to see her friends. Through it all, May felt as if she were floating slightly outside her body, watching her life change shape before her eyes. As the meeting wound down, David turned to May with a hesitant smile. I thought perhaps you might like to see your home this weekend. Just for the day, to start with. I've kept your room. He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. That is, there's a bedroom ready for you, and I thought you might like to see your mother's piano. Her piano? May echoed, suddenly fully present again. You kept it? David nodded. I could never bring myself to sell it. It's been sitting untouched all these years. It will need tuning, of course, but it's a beautiful instrument. A Steinway baby grand. May had only ever played on Pinewood's old upright with its sticky keys and out-of-tune strings. The thought of playing on a real grand piano, her mother's piano, was both thrilling and intimidating. I'd like that, she said softly. The weekend arrived more quickly than May expected. She woke early on Saturday morning, too nervous to sleep, and spent an hour trying to decide what to wear for her first visit to David's home. In the end, she chose her least worn jeans and the blue sweater Mrs. Wu had given her for her last birthday. Bao found her fussing with her hair in the small mirror they all shared. You look fine, she said, leaning against the doorframe. It's not like he doesn't know you come from an orphanage. May made a face at her friend. I just want to look nice. Is that so strange? Bao's expression softened. No, I guess not. She hesitated, then added, "You're coming back, right? Tonight, I mean." "Of course," May assured her. "It's just a visit. I'm not moving out yet." Though they both knew that day wasn't far off. David arrived exactly on time, as he always did. He had brought a car with a driver, which made May feel both special and self-conscious as the other children watched her climb into the sleek black vehicle. "It's not far," David said as they pulled away from Pinewood. "About 20 minutes, depending on traffic." May nodded, too nervous to say much. She watched out the window as the familiar neighborhood gave way to increasingly upscale areas, with larger homes and manicured gardens. Finally, they turned into a gated community, the driver nodding to the security guard who waved them through. "Here we are," David said, as they pulled up to a large house set back from the road. It wasn't as grand as May had feared, not the mansion she had imagined, but it was still easily the nicest home she had ever seen up close. Inside, the house was tastefully decorated in neutral tones, with occasional splashes of color from artwork on the walls. It was beautiful but didn't feel particularly lived in. There were no shoes kicked off by the door, no magazines left open on tables, none of the small signs of daily life that made Pinewood, for all its shabbiness, feel like a home. "Let me show you around," David said, seeming almost as nervous as May felt. He led her through the house, pointing out the kitchen, spotless, as if rarely used, the dining room formal, with a table that could seat 12, the living room, with comfortable-looking sofas but no indication anyone ever sat on them. Upstairs were bedrooms, including David's own, and at the end of the hall, the room he had prepared for May. "I wasn't sure what colors you might like," he said, opening the door. "If you don't care for it, we can change everything." May stepped inside and caught her breath. The room was lovely, painted a soft blue with a large bed, a desk by the window, and bookshelves already filled with books. It looked like a room from a magazine, perfect but impersonal. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Thank you," David smiled, visibly relieved. "There's one more room I want to show you," he said. "The most important one." He led her back downstairs and opened a door May had assumed was another closet. Instead, it revealed a small staircase leading down. "The music room is in the basement," he explained. "Better acoustics." At the bottom of the stairs, he flipped a switch, and soft lighting illuminated a room with wooden floors, scattered rugs, and in the center, a gleaming black piano. May approached it slowly, almost reverently. She had never seen anything so beautiful. The lid was closed, the polished surface reflecting the light like a dark mirror. "This was your mother's," David said, his voice gentle. "She played it every day." May reached out a hand, then hesitated, suddenly afraid to touch it. "Go ahead," David encouraged her. "It's been waiting for you." Carefully, May lifted the lid covering the keys. The ivory was yellowed slightly with age, but still beautiful. She sat on the bench, adjusting it to her height, and placed her fingers lightly on the keys, not yet pressing down. "I had it tuned yesterday," David said, standing back to give her space. "It should sound perfect." May took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of the lullaby filled the room, richer and more resonant than they had ever sounded on Pinewood's old piano. The music seemed to come not just from the instrument but from the walls themselves, as if the house had been waiting for this moment, for these notes, for her. As she played, something shifted inside May. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be awkward moments, adjustments, times when she would miss Pinewood and her friends fiercely. David was still partly a stranger to her and she to him. They had 10 years of absence to bridge, 10 years of separate lives to reconcile. But as the lullaby's final notes hung in the air, May knew with sudden clarity that she was exactly where she was meant to be, sitting at her mother's piano, in her father's house playing the music that had brought them back together. "Welcome home," David said softly. And for the first time the words felt true.